We both fell on our knees and we started crying. He said, if you want to leave, I don't blame you, I understand.
Have you ever thought fame and fortune could protect the stars from the most extreme tragedies? In reality, even when they are called the king of the stage, the basketball legend, or the immortal icon, they are still powerless, watching their partners wither away in illness. Behind all the glory, they have to witness cancer consuming the bodies of those they love, face cruel HIV rumors, and hear the choking cries of wives left paralyzed for years. Some have to live in desperation, spending the very last cent just to buy a few more days of life for their beloved. Get ready to hear the stories of 21 black artists who endured the ultimate pain when their husbands and wives were struck by incurable diseases. You might find yourself in tears. And among all the legends who once believed themselves invincible, the very first name is the most heartbreaking proof. A man who could conquer all of Hollywood, but could not save his wife. 21. Sidney Poitier, the Oscar legend, who collapsed beside his dying wife on Valentine's night. No one could have imagined the man who once made all of Hollywood kneel would end up on Valentine's night himself, kneeling on the floor, trembling as he held the cold body of his wife. Sidney Poitier was the man who believed fame was enough to withstand every pain, yet he still became a powerless husband, terrified of waking up the next morning to find no one beside him. He was the first black actor to win the Best Actor Oscar, a star who made America look up in awe, but in his whole life, he had never been as afraid as he was that night. In 1969, he met Joanna Shimkus, a Canadian actress with a gentle gaze and delicate face. They loved each other for 7 years before marrying, building a union everyone thought could never break. Then, at the end of 1989, everything began to crumble piece by piece. Joanna's voice turned hoarse again and again, and she became so exhausted she could no longer stand on her own. One December morning, she collapsed in the bathroom, her hand trembling as it clutched the sink, and Sidney panicked, carrying her to the car, his heart pounding as if it would burst. After 3 days of agonizing tests, doctors confirmed that thyroid cancer had spread. From then on, their home turned into a makeshift infirmary filled with the scent of disinfectant and the hum of breathing machines. Every morning, Sidney woke early to make porridge, helping Joanna inch across the dark hallway because she could no longer walk by herself. On February 14, 1990, the tragedy reached its peak. That evening, he came home from a meeting for a $3 million film, still holding the contract he had not yet signed. The house was eerily silent, not a sound anywhere. When he climbed the stairs, he found Joanna face down on the icy wooden floor, the lamp toppled beside her, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. He fell to his knees, hands shaking as he reached for her shoulder, his breath breaking, apart in terror. That night, he sat motionless in the hospital hallway, his suit still stained with dried blood, unable to close his eyes for fear that the next time he opened them, he would be signing her death certificate. The following months were even harsher. Each treatment bill arrived like a fresh stab, the total climbing past $500,000, wiping out every penny of savings and all the money he once thought would secure their old age. For 2 years, Sidney quietly turned down every contract, avoided the press, and cut off all invitations back to the set. One evening, he stood in the kitchen watching Joanna sit slumped against the wall, her hair falling in tufts over her shoulders, and he turned away because he could not bear the look of despair in her eyes. Eventually, Joanna recovered after many surgeries, but Sidney was no longer the proud man who once made the world bow down. His hair turned white too fast, and his back bent under the weight of so much fear. Later, he only said one thing to his daughter: "I used to think success was everything. Until that night, I realized I could lose it all in a minute." And if you were Sidney Poitier, would you have enough courage to trade your fame and fortune to hold on to every single day of life for the person you love? 20. Curtis Mayfield, when the king of funk and his wife with cancer both fell. If you think nothing could bring down a legend, listen to the story of Curtis Mayfield. He was the man who wrote "People Get Ready" and Move On Up, the songs that woke up America, the fiery artist who stepped onto the stage with eyes burning with passion. Yet no spotlight could ever pierce through the darkest months of his life, when illness came and stripped away all pride, all money, and all hope. In the summer of 1990, Curtis was preparing to launch a new album. On the afternoon of August 13, 1990, he had an outdoor performance in Brooklyn. When the massive lighting rig hanging above the stage suddenly collapsed, the crowd screamed in chaos. In those horrifying seconds, hundreds of pounds of steel crashed straight onto Curtis's back. He went down, his eyes frozen wide, his lips still mouthing the lyrics. Right then, his spine shattered. From a blazing artist, he became a man lying motionless, unable to move or provide for himself. Yet not even 4 months later, another blow struck the already broken family. At the end of December, Althida, the wife who had quietly supported everything behind the scenes, was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. They found the disease when she became too weak to stand beside her husband's bed. From that moment, their home turned into a place of desperate shelter, with two people who had once been each other's strength now only able to lie there waiting. The months that followed were even more tragic. Medical bills soared past $600,000, draining every royalty check and the lifetime of savings they had set aside. Each morning, Althida forced herself to give Curtis his medicine and then endured her own chemotherapy in the afternoon. Some nights, she sat on the floor beside the bed, her hair falling in clumps, her hand gripping Curtis's stiffened fingers. Everyone asked why she did not just leave to save herself. But Althida only looked at her motionless husband and whispered in her raw, cracked voice, "If I have to die, at least I want to die right here, next to him." What could be more heartbreaking than two people who were once each other's greatest strength reduced to lying there waiting to see who would go first? 19. James Brown, the wife who died in isolation and the cruel grip of heart failure. If Curtis Mayfield spent his days powerless watching his wife fade beside the sickbed, the story of James Brown was even darker because it was not only physical pain, but also the slow, terrifying collapse of the spirit. James Brown, the godfather of funk, the man who set the stage ablaze with "I Got You, I Feel Good," captivated millions. But behind the dazzling lights, his luxurious mansion became the setting for a tragedy few dared to mention. Adrienne Brown was once praised as a beautiful woman with bright eyes and a proud spirit who quietly managed all the backstage chaos surrounding James. Yet years of living with a husband prone to rage, addiction, and violence wore her body down. After arguments that ended with furniture smashed to pieces, Adrienne turned to painkillers just to find sleep, and the morphine addiction quietly turned into a hell she could never escape. By the fall of 1995, she had lost so much weight her friends barely recognized her. Her body was frail, her face gaunt, her breath labored like an old woman. After many fierce chest pains, Adrienne was finally diagnosed with acute heart failure. The doctors warned her heart was so weak that a single night of overdose could stop it for good. But even in her sickest days, she still faced divorce papers and the legal battles over money with the man who had once promised to love her forever. On the night of December 19, 1995, Adrienne collapsed on the cold stone staircase, a syringe still in her hand. When police and medics rushed her away, her breathing was already breaking apart. All through the emergency night, her heart stopped many times, and doctors had to shock it back 3 times to keep a fragile pulse. But she could no longer fight. Just a few days later, Adrienne died in a Los Angeles hospital. Her chest clenched a few more times, then went still. In the medical records, the cause of death was noted coldly: acute heart failure from long-term addiction and severe emotional distress. James Brown only stayed a few minutes at the funeral, standing motionless in front of the casket before he left, his face dry and empty of tears. Later, as James continued to perform and sing about freedom and passion, people still remembered the little woman who died quietly, in loneliness and despair so deep, she no longer cared to live. 18. Barry White, the king of love songs and the wife with a malignant tumor. People always believed Barry White's voice could melt any heart and heal every crack. But no one knew that even as he sang his sweet melodies on stage, the woman who had been his only love was fighting her fear of death alone, suffocating in loneliness and bitterness. That woman was Glodian White, a singer with a radiant face who once made Barry declare, "When she looks at me, every doubt disappears." And she had walked beside him through 2 decades of fame. Yet the more nights of glory they shared, the greater the distance grew between them. Barry buried himself in the studio, tangled in rumors of affairs with 2 younger singers, while Glodian quietly locked the bedroom door and took heavy doses of sleeping pills to forget all the long nights he did not come home. Then in early 1998, a sudden, twisting stomach pain brought her crashing onto the kitchen floor, her trembling hand reaching into empty air as if searching for someone to catch her. By the time the ambulance arrived, Glodian was barely conscious. Doctors found an ovarian tumor the size of a grapefruit, likely malignant, and she needed emergency surgery. Lying on the hospital bed, her body frail from malnutrition, she whispered to a nurse, "If I don't wake up, please don't let him pretend he's grieving." On February 23, 1998, the operation lasted more than 6 hours. The media never knew that Barry was standing on a stage in Paris, microphone in hand, singing "You're the First, the Last, My Everything" to a sea of cheering fans. An assistant quietly slipped the surgery notice into his jacket pocket, but Barry only glanced at it before walking back on stage once more because he refused to stop the show. When Glodian woke up, the tumor had been removed, but she was so depleted she no longer had the strength to sit up. The once lustrous black hair fell out in clumps, her pale hand twitching from the side effects of medication. In her hospital room, a white bouquet Barry sent sat on a shelf. There was no sender's name, only a short note. "Get well soon." In the months that followed, she lived like a shadow, with no reporters checking in, no stage inviting her back. The separation was never a legal divorce, but there was no love left to repair. When Barry faced kidney failure at the end of his life, they met only a few more times, sitting across a long wooden table without a single kind word between them. Someone once asked Glodian why she still came to visit him in the hospital. Maybe when you love someone long enough, you stop knowing whether you're loving, hating, or just waiting for the day when you both disappear. 17. Smokey Robinson, a love song. Torn apart by lupus. Smokey Robinson, once hailed as the heart of Motown, spent his youth writing about gentle love. But no song could save his wife Claudette when lupus silently destroyed her body day by day. It all began with dull joint pain in her fingers that made it impossible for Claudette to hold a pen to sign her name. Then, in just a few months of 1973, the pain spread to her shoulders, back, and legs. She ran fevers over 102 degrees, soaking the sheets in sweat, her lips cracked dry. The skin on her arms turned purple red, mottled like bruises, so tender that even the lightest touch felt like needles driving into her flesh. Doctors diagnosed her with systemic lupus erythematosus, a rare autoimmune disease. Her immune system had begun to mistake healthy tissue for an enemy, attacking her blood vessels, lungs, and kidneys all at once. Each night, Claudette lay curled up, gasping as fluid filled her lungs. Just turning over made pain shoot from her chest to her belly, stabbing straight through her ribs. Some nights, Smokey sat up until dawn, wiping her forehead, his hands shaking with the fear she would never wake again. Even worse, lupus caused Claudette to miscarry 3 times, each time a blood clot cutting off life to the child. The last time, she bled so heavily her skin turned ashen and her pulse slowed to a thread. In a cold operating room on a June night in 1975, Claudette opened her eyes as the doctor bent over her and said with a voice as calm as it was cruel, "Your chances of having a child are almost gone." She did not cry, just stared at the ceiling, her hand clutching the blanket to keep herself from screaming in a despair bigger than any pain she had ever known. In the years that followed, Smokey toured more often while Claudette sat alone in their vast house, living with painkillers and a sadness she could not name. When she finally left, there was no fight, because they both knew the illness had killed their last hope long before. 16. Richard Pryor. Two diseases, locking two people in despair. After Smokey, few believed another marriage tragedy could be worse. But Richard Pryor and Jennifer Lee lived through months when illness not only destroyed their bodies, but crushed their will. Jennifer was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at the end of 1990. The malignant tumor had already spread into her abdomen. The long rounds of chemotherapy made her lose more than 30 pounds in just 2 months. Her hair fell out, her skin turned a sickly green, and Jennifer could hardly sit up on her own. At the same time, Richard began to lose feeling in his limbs, slur his speech, and lose control of his expression. Doctors confirmed he had multiple sclerosis, a disease that gradually destroys the nervous system forever. On the night of January 14, 1991, Jennifer collapsed in the living room. Richard struggled to push his wheelchair closer, but his arms only trembled weakly, unable to hold his wife. Two people once famous for their strength finally became prisoners inside their own bodies. They divorced and remarried again because no one else could understand such despair, and there was never a night when they slept in peace, knowing that tomorrow would only bring another grim diagnosis. 15. Morgan Freeman. When lupus took both strength and faith. Next is the story of Morgan Freeman, one of Hollywood's most beloved voices of calm and resilience, though few knew his marriage to Myrna Colley Lee, a gifted stage designer, slowly decayed as silently as the disease that clung to her for years. At first, Myrna only felt tired and plagued by stubborn joint pain. Then a red rash spread across her back, her breath grew short. After many tests, she was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus, a disease where white blood cells destroy organs, especially dangerous when it attacks the lungs and heart. In 2006, while Morgan was filming in Europe, Myrna was hospitalized with severe respiratory failure. Doctors said her lungs had already lost more than 40% of their function. He flew home immediately. In the cold intensive care room, Myrna lay with an oxygen mask, her chest rising in weary effort. They still tried to keep their marriage alive for a few more years, but in the end, the exhaustion could no longer be hidden. Some evenings, Myrna sat staring blankly at the bottles of medicine, and Morgan could not find any words of comfort. Finally, they parted ways. No scandal, no noise. Only one simple truth remained. The disease had stolen not only her health, but also the belief that love could conquer everything. 14. Al Green. The Scars That Never Healed. In this list, the story of Al Green and Shirley Kiles is bitter proof that loving deeply has never been enough to defeat the darkness of illness and fear. With a voice smooth as honey, Al Green was called the Soul King of Memphis. But when the stage lights dimmed, their house was left with endless gloomy nights. Beginning in 1975, Shirley showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering from chronic insomnia and panic so severe she needed heavy tranquilizers. Every time Al returned from touring, she sat curled up in the kitchen corner, clutching a cold cup of tea, afraid to meet his eyes in case another outburst of rage erupted. The illness made Shirley more volatile. She testified in court that Al once pushed her down the stairs during a fight. From 1978 to 1981, she filed many domestic violence complaints, but kept withdrawing them, afraid of losing everything. In the final hearing, her voice hoarse, she said, "I don't know which scares me more, my illness or the man I used to love." 13. Isaac Hayes. The Cost of Trying to Save His Wife. Few knew that behind the deep, gravelly voice that once ruled the charts, Isaac Hayes spent years exhausted as the only safe harbor for a wife sentenced to die by cancer. Isaac Hayes, the funk genius behind Theme from Shaft, never imagined that his peak of fame would collapse for such a heartbreaking reason. In 1998, his wife Adjoa was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The tumor had already spread to her ribs and liver. each day leaving her too weak to go on. Isaac slowly sold off his vintage cars, then mortgaged their Atlanta mansion to cover treatment costs, climbing into the hundreds of thousands. He often sat all night beside her bed, his hand resting on Adjowa's shoulder as she drifted into a drugged sleep after chemotherapy. By 2000, when Adjowa slipped into a coma, Isaac quietly admitted to friends that he had lost everything, but if he could choose again, he would do it all the same. All just to hold on to the woman who had once been the only family he had. 12. Marvin Gaye, The Shattering Separation. Marvin Gaye could make millions of fans cry, but he could never soothe Anna Gordy herself, the wife 17 years his senior. Starting in 1975, Anna sank into severe anxiety and depression. She feared crowds so much she didn't dare leave the house, locking her bedroom door every night, sitting by the bed clutching a small knife because she was haunted by the thought someone wanted to kill her. Her panic attacks erupted in the middle of the night, forcing Marvin to call for help more than once when he thought she'd stopped breathing. The illness trapped them in a vicious cycle of blame. When the divorce erupted in 1977, Anna sued Marvin for emotional damages. The trial dragged on for a year, the press swarming them. Once, Anna broke down crying on the witness stand, confessing she had once tried to kill herself because she believed she no longer had any worth to be loved. In the end, the marriage collapsed into exhaustion, leaving behind a nameless fear Marvin carried to his last day. 11. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the man who couldn't defeat his wife's illness. Perhaps no image was more striking than the giant Kareem Abdul-Jabbar stepping onto a roaring basketball court only to return each night to a hospital room, silently watching his wife wither from thyroid cancer. Kareem, the legendary NBA star, once believed he was strong enough to protect anyone. But in 1976, when Habiba, his gentle and private wife, was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, every illusion shattered. The tumor grew so fast that within 6 months, Habiba's voice had become hoarse, her breath constantly ragged. Every chemo session left her collapsed against Kareem's shoulder, hair falling all over the hospital floor. Through 1977, Kareem canceled many games to stay by her side, but the distance between them only grew. He couldn't bear watching the woman who once glowed become a weary shadow, while Habiba refused to be a burden. Finally, when the disease reached its last stage, their marriage had nothing left to hold on to. Habiba moved out, leaving Kareem standing alone in the empty room, wondering if there was anything he hadn't done enough to make her stay. 10. Sammy Davis Jr., the wife who received 2 death sentences. Who could have imagined that the man who embodied the Rat Pack, dressed in style and smiling brilliantly on every stage, would end his days beside a wife facing not 1 but 2 death sentences? In early 2003, Altavice Davis began to lose her voice and cough up blood. Within weeks, doctors confirmed nasopharyngeal cancer, the tumor so large it crushed her vocal cords until every word was a strangled gasp. Yet the tragedy didn't stop there. On the morning of September 12, 2004, her blood test results suddenly reported she was HIV positive, news so shocking even her closest friends were speechless. The public erupted with speculation, some insisting the disease came from a reckless past or an ill-fated transfusion. Sammy had died years before, leaving behind more than $7 million in tax debt that Altavice struggled to repay by auctioning off everything he once loved. In her final night, she lay on a rented, cramped bed, IV tube in her chest, her breath mingling with the damp smell of the walls. Friends recalled she once whispered that dying of illness was bad enough, but dying in disgrace was the greatest humiliation of her life. 9. Magic Johnson, 2 diseases and the fear of contagion. Behind all the bright lights, the story of Magic Johnson and Cookie Johnson still chills many to this day. When Magic announced he was HIV positive in 1991, Cookie had just given birth. Her body still fragile, and the terror of contagion kept her awake countless nights, too scared to touch anything in the house. But the tragedy only grew deeper. On the morning of April 18, 2005, while changing clothes, Cookie found a hard lump under her breast. A quick biopsy confirmed early-stage breast cancer that required urgent surgery. As the doctor explained treatment protocols, Cookie remained silent, staring at magic, her hands trembling so badly that the glass slipped and shattered on the floor. The operation happened exactly on their 13th wedding anniversary. When she woke up in recovery, Cookie gazed at the cold ceiling, the wound still seeping blood, unable to believe life could push them this far into misery. In the years that followed, she lived in the uneasy rhythm of taking antiviral drugs and hormones, always bracing for worse news. 8. Hank Aaron, the record breaker and the paralyzed wife. Hank Aaron stunned America by breaking the record of 755 home runs, but as the crowd roared, he returned to a silent house where his wife clung to each frail breath. Beginning in 1982, Billy was diagnosed with systemic lupus and severe arthritis, illnesses that made her joints swell and throb until she could no longer lift a spoon. On the evening of February 22, 1986, Hank came home late after a game, walked through the dark hallway, and froze when he saw Billy curled on the bathroom floor, her legs paralyzed. From that day on, she was confined to a wheelchair, never able to stand on her own again. Hank sold his beloved sports car to install an automatic lift, but he could never buy back the smile that once brightened their little kitchen. In her final years, Billy lived in silence, her skin pale from the immune suppressants. Each night, Hank sat by her bed, still trying to tell funny stories, but in her eyes remained an exhaustion no words could erase. 7. David Ruffin, two addictions that destroyed a home. Among the list of artists who once believed themselves invincible, David Ruffin's tragedy reminds us that not every disease begins in the body. Sometimes it starts in the mind and spreads like a fire no one can stamp out. While David was addicted to cocaine to the point his career collapsed, his wife, Sandra Ruffin, quietly unraveled in another way. In 1978, Sandra fell into severe depression with endless insomnia, always needing tranquilizers just to survive the day. On the night of November 14, 1981, neighbors called the police after hearing violent banging from the Detroit apartment. They found Sandra lying motionless on the floor, an empty bottle of sleeping pills rolling near her feet. Beside her was David, sobbing, his hands still shaking from drugs. Sandra was rushed to the hospital in time, but suffered neurological damage that left her unable to work, plunging the family into crushing debt. For years after, no one knew who had pulled whom down first, only that both had become prisoners of their own addictions. 6. Percy Sledge, a song traded for one last hope. Some have said the greatest tragedy of Percy Sledge's life wasn't poverty, but realizing that legendary voice could not save the one he loved most. His wife, Rosa, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in 1995, right as Percy's career was fading. On the night of August 9, 1996, Percy held a benefit concert in Alabama, singing "When a Man Loves a Woman" through tears, knowing the ticket sales were the last hope for chemotherapy. Rosa sat backstage in a wheelchair, gaunt, her hair falling out in clumps. Every time Percy stepped off stage, she would squeeze his hand and whisper, "I'm sorry for making you sing to pay the hospital bills." Even though Percy scraped together enough money for a few more months of treatment, the illness still won. In 1997, Rosa passed away, leaving Percy alone in a silent house, wondering whether the voice that once moved the world had bought them only that little time. 5. Sam Moore, when drugs and disease brought down the roof. Perhaps nothing was more shocking than the morning of March 19, 1988, when police stormed Sam Moore's Florida apartment and found Joyce Moore in a diabetic coma while Sam was still rummaging through a bag of freshly bought heroin. Joyce had battled severe diabetes for years, her leg partly amputated from infection, her vision nearly gone. Sam had once promised to quit drugs to care for her, but the addiction clung to him like a shadow. On nights when Joyce had seizures, Sam would be crouched by the curtains hiding his syringes, too dazed to call for help. When the media picked up the story, the two became the image of collapse, a legendary soul voice and a wife so sick she couldn't afford insulin. In the end, when Joyce regained consciousness after emergency care, the doctor could only look at Sam and shake his head. Everyone knew it wasn't only disease that kills a family, it was surrendering to despair. 4. Eddie Kendricks, cancer that struck down a husband and wife together. If Sam Moore's story once made people shudder at the tangle of addiction and illness, Eddie Kendricks's tragedy was even more harrowing when cancer seemed to bring down both spouses at once. In 1991, Patricia Kendricks was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer, the tumor spreading so fast she couldn't dress herself. Just a year later, while Eddie was arranging her chemo treatments, he began coughing blood, and the doctor flatly announced, lung cancer. On the morning of April 15, 1992, Eddie woke up in their Nashville apartment, seeing Patricia lying limp, her chest wrapped in white bandages, while he wheezed like he might stop breathing any moment. They no longer had the strength to comfort each other, only holding hands, waiting to see who would go first. At last, Patricia died in early 1993, leaving Eddie gasping in a hospital room filled with the smell of morphine. The nurse said on his final night, he clung to the iron bed frame and whispered just one sentence, "I don't know what we ever did to deserve dying like this." 3. Ray Charles, when addiction and cancer came all at once. Perhaps nothing was more shocking than the night of August 11, 1989, when the housekeeper opened Ray Charles's door and found him sitting motionless, a fresh syringe full of drugs still in his hand, while his wife Della Robinson lay emaciated on the IV bed, her body so thin under a sheet that every rib showed. Della had been diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer in 1987, and for 3 years she endured brutal radiation as Ray never broke free of addiction. Every night he would sing her to sleep while secretly injecting heroin to escape the stench of chemicals that clung to every wall. Family said when Della died, Ray did not shed a single tear, only clutching the bottle of painkillers she had left behind. Long afterward, rumors persisted that he once tried to hide her mastectomy to preserve the public image of a happy family, but no one dared to confirm if that was the truth. 2. Levi Stubbs, the man who gave up music to await a painful ending. Has anyone ever wondered what the cruelest thing in life is? Maybe it's watching the person you love most fade away while music, the thing that once saved you, no longer means anything. Levi Stubbs knew this better than anyone. When Clinice, his wife, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in 1998, Levi immediately announced he was quitting singing, rejecting every tour even as the Four Tops were preparing their career anniversary. From then on, he stayed up every night listening for her cough, cooking thin porridge, taping injection reminders all over their Detroit home. On the night of February 4, 2001, Clinice died on their old wooden bed, and Levi knelt by the side, burying his face in the blanket until dawn seeped through the curtains. They had dreamed of growing old together after the stage lights dimmed, but in the end, only one of them remained, and no song could ease the ache. 1. Diahann Carroll, the final chapter of a proud life. And finally, no story is more sorrowful than the journey of Diahann Carroll, the first black actress to win an Emmy, once revered across Hollywood. Yet as the spotlight dimmed, she spent the last 2 years of her life caring for her fourth husband, Vic Damone, as he battled late-stage prostate cancer. Starting in spring 2000, Vic grew weaker, his hip bones so brittle they fractured just from stumbling on the bed frame. Diahann moved into a small Palm Beach apartment, washing him herself and feeding him pills every morning. She accepted no more roles, ignoring offers from the biggest studios. On the morning of October 12, 2002, Vic took his last breath while Diahann held his hand, her lips murmuring the old song they once sang together. People said that night she sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty bed, softly saying, "It turns out loving with all your heart only leads you to the greatest pain. When you finish reading these 21 tragedies, perhaps you'll realize the spotlight that once made them immortal was only a thin layer of paint hiding their despair. Though they were hailed as legends, they still sat powerless beside hospital beds, drained of every dollar, watching cancer and depression steal the ones they loved. Which fate makes you grieve the most? Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the hidden stories of Hollywood that have never been revealed.